Before we begin, take a look around your office. Look at your team. Who is the one person holding it all together? The one who doesn't get the applause, but handles the weight? If that's you, if you are the glue, drop unsung hero in the comments right now. This story is for you. This is the story of the man who held the place together. Chapter 1. The man who held the place together. I wasn't the face of the company. You know the face. The one in the press releases. The one on the stage. The one who takes the bow. I wasn't that. I was something else. Something harder to photograph. I was the structure. Think about a building. Everyone admires the glass, the facade, the way the light hits the lobby. But no one takes a selfie with the steel beams. No one applauds the foundation. But take them away, and the glass shatters. The lobby collapses. I was the person things passed through when they truly mattered. Not the easy wins, the disasters, the quiet crises. Though we need this fixed by morning whispers. I was the one problems landed on when no one else wanted ownership. When the title was too vague or the risk was too high, it ended up on my desk. And I didn't complain. I didn't seek visibility. Visibility is a trap. It makes you a target. I sought stability. I wanted the machine to hum. I wanted the silence of a system working perfectly. And that is how they learned to lean on me. Slowly, heavily, without ever noticing the weight. They thought the floor was just solid. They didn't know I was the one holding it up. They confused my competence with ease. They thought, oh, it just works. No, it doesn't just work. It is worked by me. Every single day, I was the structure. And structure is invisible until it breaks. And let's talk about the cost. Being the structure means you don't get to sway in the wind. You have to be rigid. You have to take the load. I remember nights when the servers went down or the deal was about to fall through and the faces of the company were sleeping. I was awake. I was the one making the calls. I was the one rewriting the contracts. I was the one patching the holes in the hull while they toasted to a smooth voyage. They call it reliability. I call it sacrifice. Because when you are the structure, you don't get sick days. Pillars don't take vacations. If you move, the roof comes down. So you stay planted. You absorb the shock. You dampen the noise. And in return, you get ignored. But that was the deal I made. I traded glory for necessity. I told myself that being essential was better than being famous. That being the backbone was more noble than being the smile. I was wrong. I wasn't building a legacy. I was just building a comfortable chair for someone else to sit in. Someone who didn't know how the legs were joined. Someone who thought the comfort was a right, not a result of my engineering. I was the man who held the place together. And for a long time, I was proud of that. I didn't realize that by holding it together, I was preventing them from seeing that it was broken. I was the tape on the cracking pipe. I was the patch on the leaking tire. I made the broken look whole. And that was my mistake. Chapter 2. How I became irreplaceable without a title. I built workflows no one documented. It started as a way to save time. A macro here, a process there. But over years, those shortcuts became highways. I constructed an entire shadow infrastructure that the company ran on, but didn't know existed. There were manuals, sure, but the manuals described how the company thought it worked. My mind held the map of how it actually worked. I knew that if you pressed button A, you had to check report B, or the system would crash 3 days later. No one wrote that down. I just knew. I became the ghost in the machine, the living documentation. New hires would come in with their training binders, and within a week, they'd be at my desk asking, how do we really do this? I held the institutional memory. I held the keys to the secret passages. I was the architect of the invisible. And for a while, I felt powerful. I thought this knowledge was job security. I didn't realize it was a cage. I had made myself essential to the process, but invisible to the payroll. Fixed failures no one logged. This is the trap of the high performer. You see a fire, you put it out before anyone smells smoke. To the manager, there was no fire. To the CEO, it was a smooth quarter. To the client, it was seamless service. But my hands were covered in ash. I solved problems before they escalated. I anticipated the crash. I predicted the shortage. I caught the typo that would have cost millions. And because I caught them, they never happened. And because they never happened, they didn't exist. I created a reality distortion field for leadership. They lived in a world where everything just worked. They didn't see the frantic paddling under the water. They didn't see the late nights patching the code. They didn't see the near misses. I protected them from the truth of their own fragility. I thought I was being a good soldier. I thought I was protecting the company. But really, I was blinding them. By removing the pain of failure, I removed the signal that the system was broken. Management praised outcomes, not origins. They looked at the quarterly results and patted themselves on the back for their strategy. They congratulated each other on efficiency. They didn't realize their strategy was just me, staying late, bridging the gap between their fantasy and reality. That was fine. For a long time, that was fine. I told myself I was indispensable. I told myself I held the keys. I fed on the quiet pride of being the one who knew, until it wasn't. Because when you make the impossible look easy, people start to think it's easy. When you make the miracle routine, it stops being a miracle. It becomes a KPI. They started to ask, why does this take so long? About tasks that shouldn't have been possible at all. They started to question my headcount because everything runs so smoothly. The resentment began to grow. The silence of my success became deafening. I realized I hadn't built a fortress. I had built a glass house, and I was the only one holding up the ceiling, and my arms were getting tired. Chapter 3. When efficiency became an obsession. New leadership arrived talking about optimization. It's a seductive word, isn't it? Optimization. It sounds like making things better, but in the corporate world, it usually just means making things cheaper. They came in with their crisp suits and their slide decks. They spoke a language of buzzwords. Cost-cutting, lean teams, scalability, synergy. They didn't ask why systems worked. They didn't sit down with me and ask, how do we keep this running? They sat down and asked, how much does this cost? They looked at the organization like a machine that had too many parts. They didn't see an ecosystem. They saw a spreadsheet. And on a spreadsheet, redundancy looks like waste. On a spreadsheet, experience looks like an expensive line item. They walked the floor, pointing at processes they didn't understand, asking, is this necessary? I wanted to scream. Is the braking system on your car necessary? It only slows you down. Think of how much faster you could go without it. But they weren't listening to the mechanic. They were listening to the accountants. They assumed success was automatic. They measured everything. They measured keystrokes. They measured ticket closure times. They measured utilization rates. But they measured the wrong things. They measured the speed of the output, but not the quality of the judgment. They measured how fast I fixed a problem, but not how many problems I prevented from ever happening. You can't measure prevention. There is no metric for disaster averted. So when they looked at my day, they saw gaps. They saw me thinking. They saw me double-checking. To them, that was friction. To them, that was inefficiency. They wanted to streamline. They wanted to strip away the fat. They didn't realize that the fat was actually muscle. It was the buffer. It was the margin for error. They treated the company like a startup that needed to move fast and break things. But we weren't a startup. We were a supertanker. And when you break things on a supertanker, you don't pivot. You sink. That's the arrogance of people who inherit stability. It is a specific kind of blindness. It affects people who walk into a house that is warm and dry and assume it's just naturally that way. They don't see the furnace working in the basement. They don't see the insulation in the walls. They think the warmth is a property of the air itself. So they start knocking down walls because they want an open concept. They turn off the furnace to save on gas because it's already warm in here. They inherit a system that is robust because of the people like me who built it to be robust. And they mistake that robustness for invincibility. They thought the system could take the abuse. They thought they could cut the supports and the roof would just float. They looked at me, the person holding the flashlight in the dark, and asked why I was wasting batteries when the sun was shining. They didn't know the night was coming. And they didn't know I was the only one who knew how to change the batteries. Chapter 4. The first decision that sealed their fate. They outsourced part of my role. It wasn't a surprise. I saw the meetings on the calendar. Strategic resource allocation. They told me it was about focus. They said, we want you to focus on high-level strategy while we move the routine tasks offshore. Cheaper labor, faster turnaround, 24/7 coverage. The slide deck looked perfect. They told me to oversee the transition. Do you know what that feels like? It feels like digging your own grave and then being asked to train the person who will push you into it. I sat on Zoom calls at 2 a.m. with a team halfway across the world. They were eager. They were polite. They were cheap. But I noticed something immediately, something the consultants didn't see. The consultants saw a list of tasks. They saw process invoice, update server, route ticket. I saw a web of decisions. I saw context. I saw history. They thought they were buying my hands. They didn't realize they needed my head. The new system copied tasks, not judgment. They asked for documentation. Write down everything you do, they said. So I tried. I really did. I wrote down the steps. Step 1, open the file. Step 2, check the data. Step 3, approve. But I couldn't write down step 2.5. Notice that the client's tone in the email was slightly off, so check their payment history. Realize they are about to churn and flag it to the VP. You can't document a feeling. You can't upload a hunch. The new team followed the checklist perfectly. They opened the file. They checked the data. They approved. And they missed the churn. They missed the warning signs. To management, the transition was a success. The tasks were being completed. The tickets were being closed. But the quality of the work was hollow. It was like a photocopy of a photocopy. The shape was there, but the detail was gone. They were painting by numbers, but they were colorblind. The new system was a zombie. It looked alive. It moved. It ate data, but there was no soul inside. There was no one asking why. There was only how. And when an exception occurred, when something happened that wasn't in the manual, the system froze. The new team would email me, "This is not in the documentation. Please advise." So instead of freeing me up for high-level strategy, I became the Tier 3 support for my own replacement. I wasn't doing the work anymore. I was fixing the work that was done wrong. I became the safety net for a trapeze act that didn't know how to fly. And management? They celebrated the cost savings. They looked at the payroll reduction and popped the champagne. They didn't see that they had traded a brain for a robot. And robots are great, until the script breaks. And the script always breaks. Chapter 5. Training without transferring wisdom. I documented what I could. I sat in a conference room with a whiteboard and a recorder. I spoke for hours. I wrote down the logins. I wrote down the contact numbers. I wrote down the if this, then that logic. I created flowcharts that covered 3 walls. I indexed the shared drive. I labeled the cables. It was a masterpiece of instruction. It was the most comprehensive operating manual this company had ever seen. But it was a failure of education. Because instruction is about the what. Education is about the why. I could tell them what to do when the server light turned red. Reboot the primary node. But I couldn't tell them why I knew to wait exactly 30 seconds before hitting the button, or why I knew that if the fan sounded a certain way, it wasn't a software issue at all. I gave them the map, but I couldn't give them the compass. They memorized the map. They could recite the route. But the moment the terrain changed, they were lost. But you can't document instinct. Instinct isn't magic. It's not a superpower. Instinct is just pain that has healed into pattern recognition. You can't upload experience. Experience is the scar tissue of mistakes you survived. I knew to check the backup generator not because it was on a list, but because 10 years ago, I stood in the dark when the power failed and swore I'd never let it happen again. I knew to distrust the vendor's timeline not because of policy, but because I had spent a Christmas Eve fixing their deployment. You cannot transfer that. You cannot transfer the fear in your gut. You cannot transfer the sleepless nights. I tried to explain this to the new team. I told them stories. Once, in 2018. They nodded politely. They took notes. Okay, so check generator. Got it. They wrote down the action, but they missed the urgency. They treated the check like a chore, not a lifeline. They didn't have the scars, so they didn't have the instinct. They wanted checklists. They wanted a safety net made of paper. They wanted a world where if they followed the steps, they would be safe. If we follow the process, we can't be blamed. That was their mantra. I had carried consequences. I knew that the process doesn't care about your excuses. I knew that if the system fails, it doesn't matter if you followed step 4 correctly. The system is still dead. The client is still angry. I lived in a world of outcomes. They lived in a world of outputs. I tried to give them the weight of that responsibility. I tried to hand it over like a physical object. Here, take this. It's heavy, but they just looked at their hands. They didn't feel it. They thought the weight was in the badge I was about to hand in. They thought the power was in the title. They didn't realize the power was in the consequences I had absorbed for a decade. And now, I was walking away, and the consequences were about to find a new place to land. Chapter 6. The day they decided I was too expensive. It was said politely. It always is. It was a Tuesday. It's always a Tuesday. The calendar invite was vague. Quick sync. Or catch up. But when I walked into the room, the air was different. The blinds were drawn. There was a stranger in the room. Someone from HR. Someone with a notepad and a box of tissues, just in case things got emotional. I knew before I sat down. I saw the manila folder on the table. The thin one. The one that holds your life in 3 sheets of paper. My boss wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked at his shoes. He looked at the wall. He looked anywhere but at the person who had saved his department a dozen times. It wasn't personal, he said. It was just business. But business is personal when it's your rent. Business is personal when it's the decade you spent building something that they are now dismantling. Redundancy, restructuring, strategic alignment. They used soft words to describe a hard thing. They wrapped the knife in velvet. We are moving in a different direction. Your role has been absorbed. This is an opportunity for you. They spoke about the company like it was a ship that needed to shed weight to go faster. And I was the cargo. I was the ballast. They believed the machine could now run without me. They had the manuals, the ones I wrote. They had the team, the one I trained. They had the workflows, the ones I built. They looked at my salary line item and saw a big number. They thought, if we remove this, the profit margin goes up. It was simple arithmetic, subtraction. They didn't realize that salary wasn't just for the hours I sat in the chair. It was the retainer fee for when things went wrong. It was the insurance premium against catastrophe. You don't cancel your fire insurance because your house hasn't burned down in 5 years. But that's exactly what they were doing. Machines don't notice missing bolts. Not at first. You can take a bolt out of an engine, and it will keep running. It might vibrate a little more. It might rattle, but it turns. So they thought, see, we didn't need that bolt. That bolt was expensive. That bolt was arrogant. They high-fived. They celebrated the efficiency. But a machine doesn't fail the moment the bolt is removed. It fails when the vibration starts to loosen the other bolts. It fails when the pressure builds up. It fails when the load increases. They removed the structural integrity of the department to save a few dollars. They thought they were trimming fat. They were cutting bone. I looked at them across the table. The HR rep pushed the paper toward me. Sign here. I signed. I didn't argue. I didn't warn them. Why warn a man who is sawing off the branch he is sitting on? He won't listen. He's too focused on the saw. Machines don't notice missing bolts until they do. And when they do, it's usually too late to put them back. Chapter 7. The exit they thought was clean. I handed over my badge. It felt lighter than I expected. I packed my things. It's strange how 10 years of life can fit into a single cardboard box. A dying plant, a mug with a chipped rim, a framed certificate for Employee of the Month from 2015. That was it. That was the physical footprint of my decade. I walked past the server room one last time. I could hear the hum. It sounded different to me now. It sounded like it was holding its breath. They wished me well. They shook my hand. Their grips were loose. They were already looking past me. They were already thinking about their lunch orders. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I didn't tell them that the backup script had a bug that I manually patched every Tuesday. I didn't tell them that the vendor needed to be called exactly at 4 p.m. on Fridays or the shipment would be late. I took my knowledge with me. I put it in the box with the mug, and I walked out. I already knew what would happen. Systems fail in silence first. That's the thing about momentum. A massive object doesn't stop the moment you cut the engine. It coasts. For the first week, nothing happened. The lights stayed on. The emails flowed. They probably looked at each other and said, see, we didn't need him. Look how smooth this is. They mistook coasting for driving. They didn't realize that the only reason they were moving forward was because of the speed I had built up over 10 years. They were riding on my fumes. They celebrated their clean exit. They thought they had performed surgery. They thought they had removed the tumor. They didn't realize they had removed the heart. The heart can beat for a few seconds after it leaves the body, but not for long. Entropy is a patient killer. Rust doesn't scream. It waits. The data corruption didn't happen overnight. It started as a single bit flipping in a dark corner of a database. The client relationship didn't blow up in a day. It started with one unanswered email, one missed deadline. I sat at home, drinking coffee on a Wednesday morning, and I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't holding up the ceiling anymore. My arms could rest. I wondered if they felt the ceiling lowering. Just an inch, just a millimeter. Probably not. Not yet. They were still in the honeymoon phase of their own ignorance. They were enjoying the silence. They didn't know that silence wasn't peace. It was the eye of the hurricane, and the wind was about to change direction. Chapter 8. The errors that started small. A deadline missed. A client complaint dismissed. A data inconsistency explained away. It started with a single ticket. Priority 3. Ticket number 4092. Data mismatch on the Q3 projection. It seems so innocent. Just a little red flag in a sea of green. A rounding error. A ghost in the machine. No one panicked. Why would they? It was just a number in a cell. They did what I would never have done. They manually overrode it. They forced the cell to match the expectation. Fixed, they said. They closed the ticket. They patted themselves on the back for their speed. They didn't ask why the number was wrong. They didn't trace the thread back to the source. If they had, they would have seen that the API connection to the bank was timing out by 0.5 seconds. They would have seen that I used to have a script that checked for that lag and compensated for it. But they deleted that script last month. Legacy code, they called it. Bloatware. Technical debt. So they forced the number. They treated the symptom and ignored the disease. And the crack in the foundation got a little wider. Then the drift began. It wasn't a crash. It was a drift. The reports were generated, but they felt off. A client called. My invoice is wrong. Customer support apologized. Glitch in the system, they said. They issued a credit. Then another client called. My inventory count is off. Glitch in the system, they said again. They started using the word glitch like a shield, as if a glitch was a random act of God, like lightning or hail. It wasn't a glitch. It was rot. And it wasn't just the data that was rotting. It was the trust. When the data lies, trust evaporates. Sales stopped trusting operations. Operations stopped trusting finance. The warehouse manager started keeping his own spreadsheets because he couldn't rely on the ERP. The sales team started promising delivery dates they knew were lies, just to close the deal. The social contract of the company began to fray. The different parts of the machine were no longer talking to each other. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. The database thought we had stock. The warehouse knew we didn't. The website sold it anyway. Chaos is not an explosion. Chaos is 1,000 small misunderstandings happening at once. They blamed individuals, not architecture. When the errors piled up, they looked for someone to punish. They needed a villain. Because if there was no villain, then the problem was the system. And they owned the system. They blamed the junior developer who pushed the code. They blamed the account manager who took the order. They blamed the vendor. They blamed the software update. They blamed the weather. They blamed everyone but the architect who was no longer there. They had meetings, postmortems, root cause analysis. They sat in boardrooms with expensive coffee and pointed fingers. But they never found the root. Because the root was missing. The root was the person who knew that the system was held together by tension, and they had cut the wire. I heard about the meeting where they fired the junior dev. They called it accountability. It wasn't accountability. It was a sacrifice. They threw a body into the volcano hoping it would stop the eruption. They thought that by punishing the people, they could fix the machine. It was like whipping a horse because the cart has no wheels. The horse isn't the problem. The cart is broken, and the cart was about to tip over. Chapter 9. When the failures began to compound. What I used to catch early now surfaced publicly. It wasn't a drip anymore. It was a flood. The support inbox hit 1,000 unread messages. Then 5,000. Then it just stopped counting. The phones didn't stop ringing. The whole music became the soundtrack of the office. Escalation stacked. A Tier 1 ticket became a Tier 2 ticket in an hour. A Tier 2 ticket became a VP escalation by lunch. The managers were running from fire to fire with buckets of water, but they were using gasoline. They didn't have the context. They didn't know that the server crash was related to the inventory update from last night. They treated them as separate events. They tried to fix them in isolation. But in a complex system, nothing is isolated. Everything is connected. When you pull a thread here, the fabric tears over there. And they were pulling on every thread they could find. Fixes contradicted each other. This was the most painful part to watch. Team A would deploy a patch to fix the database latency, but that patch assumed a certain data format. Team B, trying to fix the website crash, changed that data format. So Team A's patch broke Team B's fix, and Team B's fix crashed Team A's database. They were fighting each other for resources. They were blaming each other for the downtime. It worked on my machine, they shouted. Well, it broke production. They were playing whack-a-mole with a hydra. Every time they smashed a bug, 2 more heads appeared. Departments stopped trusting outputs. Marketing stopped trusting the sales numbers. Finance stopped trusting the expense reports. The single source of truth was gone. There were 5 versions of the truth, and they were all wrong. The system lost coherence. It was no longer a unified organism. It was a collection of panicked organs fighting for survival. Then it spilled over. It left the building. Twitter started trending. Not the good kind. #fail was attached to our brand name. LinkedIn posts from angry clients started to go viral. Used to be a great service. What happened? The CEO had to make a statement. He stood in front of a camera, looking tired and confused. He blamed a technical vendor. He blamed unprecedented demand. He blamed growing pains. He didn't blame the decision to fire the architect. He didn't blame the decision to cut costs. He apologized. He promised to do better. He promised a comprehensive review. But you can't review what you don't understand. The public shaming didn't stop the errors. It just added pressure. And pressure on a broken system doesn't make it stronger. It makes it shatter. The cracks were no longer hairline fractures. They were canyons, and everyone could see them. Chapter 10, the cost they couldn't hide. Clients noticed. Audits followed. It started with the small clients, the ones we used to call the long tail. They didn't renew. They didn't complain. They just stopped paying. Then the mid-market clients. They sent emails. We are reviewing our vendor relationships. That's corporate speak for you are fired. Then the enterprise clients. The whales. The ones that paid the bills. They didn't just leave. They sued. They cited breach of SLA. They cited failure to deliver. The sales team was frantic. They offered discounts. They offered rebates. They offered free months. But you can't discount incompetence. You can't rebate trust. The clients didn't want cheaper service. They wanted reliable service. And we had traded reliability for cheapness months ago. The revenue graph, which had been a steady climb for a decade, turned into a cliff. And the leadership team, standing at the edge, looked down and finally realized they couldn't fly. Then came the audit. Not the internal audit. The regulatory audit. The one with teeth. The one with fines. I used to prepare for this audit for 3 months. I had binders. I had logs. I had a war room. The new team didn't even know it was coming. When the auditors walked into the lobby, the director of operations asked, "Who are they?" That was the moment the blood drained from the CFO's face. They asked for the compliance logs. We don't have those. They asked for the disaster recovery plan. We're working on it. They asked for the access control records. We can't find them. The auditors didn't yell. They didn't get angry. They just wrote. They wrote and they wrote. Every mark on their page was a fine. Every sentence was a violation. What had been efficient was revealed as fragile. They had built a race car out of cardboard. It looked fast on the showroom floor. It looked sleek. It looked efficient. But the moment it rained, it dissolved. They didn't lose money first. They lost credibility. Money is renewable. Credibility is finite. Once it's spent, it's gone. They spent a decade of credibility in a single quarter of efficiency. They burned the brand to keep the lights on. Competitors, who hadn't been able to touch us for years, started circling. They smelled blood. They didn't even have to sell. They just had to answer the phone. Our clients were calling them, begging to be rescued. And internally, the talent drain was a hemorrhage. The good people left first. The engineers who knew the difference between code and spaghetti. The support agents who actually cared. They saw the ship taking on water and they got on the lifeboats. The ones who stayed were the ones who couldn't leave. The ones who had nowhere else to go. That's harder to rebuild. You can rebuild a server in an hour. You can rebuild a database in a day. But you can't fix a feeling. Once a client feels unsafe, they never feel safe again. It's like a relationship after an affair. You can say sorry, you can buy flowers, but the doubt is always there. The board was asking questions. The shareholders were asking questions. And for the first time, the slide deck with the buzzwords didn't have the answers. The optimization had optimized us right out of the market. And all that was left was the echo of their arrogance. Chapter 11, the meeting I wasn't invited to. Executives demanded answers. Managers deflected. The boardroom was no longer a place of strategy. It was a place of interrogation. The chairman of the board sat at the head of the table. He didn't look at the slide deck. He looked at the CEO. "Why is revenue down 40%? He asked. His voice was quiet. Quiet is worse than loud. Why are we trending on Twitter for outages? Why is our largest client suing us for breach of contract? The CEO looked at the VP of sales. The VP of sales looked at the VP of operations. The VP of operations looked at the director of IT. The chain of command became a chain of blame. "It's the market," said sales. "It's the software," said ops. "It's the legacy infrastructure," said IT. They threw buzzwords at the chairman like sand, hoping to blind him. Digital transformation, headwinds, pivot. But the chairman wiped the sand from his eyes and asked again, "Who knows how to fix this?" And for the first time in that room, there was silence. No one could explain why things were failing, only where. They had dashboards full of red lights. They knew that the server was down. They knew that the inventory was wrong. But they didn't know why. They didn't understand the causal relationships. They didn't understand that the inventory system relied on a nightly batch job that only ran if the server load was below 50%. They didn't know that because I wrote that rule 5 years ago to prevent a crash. And since they fired me, they had ramped up the server load to 90% to optimize utilization. So the batch job never ran, and the inventory never updated. And the clients bought products that didn't exist. They were looking at the symptoms of a disease they couldn't diagnose. They looked around the table. They looked at the empty chair. The chair that used to be mine. The chair they had emptied to save money. The chair that was now the most expensive piece of furniture in the building. That's when they remembered me. It started as a whisper. A junior manager, maybe someone I had helped once, spoke up. You know who would know? The room went cold. Don't say it. The CEO's eyes seemed to say. He knew how the batch jobs worked. The manager continued. He knew the legacy code. He's gone. The HR director snapped. He was redundant. Is he? Asked the chairman. Because it seems like his knowledge is currently very required. The name hung in the air. My name. It was no longer the name of a cost center. It was the name of a solution. They realized that by firing me, they hadn't saved a salary. They had thrown away the map to the maze they were now trapped in. Desperation changes the math. Suddenly, I wasn't expensive anymore. Suddenly, I was a bargain. The CEO sighed. He rubbed his temples. He looked at my former director. Do you have his number? Chapter 12. The call they hesitated to make. My former director spoke carefully. I was in the grocery store when the phone rang. I looked at the caller ID. It was a number I had deleted from my contacts, but burned into my memory. I let it ring 3 times. Ring. That was for the Tuesday morning meeting. Ring. That was for the empty box. Ring. That was for the silence. I answered. Hello. There was a pause. A hesitation. The sound of a man swallowing his pride. Hey, he said. It's been a while. He asked how I was. He asked about my family. He made small talk while the building behind him was burning down. I didn't make it easy for him. I didn't fill the silence. I just waited. I could hear the stress in his voice, the tightness, the lack of sleep. He wasn't calling to catch up. He was calling because he had run out of options. We're experiencing some instability. That was the word he chose. Instability. It's a sterile word. It sounds like a table with a wobbly leg. It doesn't sound like a catastrophic system failure that is costing the company millions. We've had some hiccups with the transition, he said. There have been some challenges with the new vendor. We are facing some turbulence. He sounded like a pilot getting on the intercom to explain that the wings had fallen off. I listened. I let him spin his web of soft words. I knew what instability meant. It meant the database was deadlocked. It meant the backups were corrupted. It meant the clients were screaming. He was trying to minimize the disaster because if he admitted the scale of it, he would have to admit the scale of his mistake. He was trying to frame it as a minor issue that just needed a little tweak, a little consulting. We were wondering if you had some time, he said, just to look at it. He asked if I could consult. Short term, urgent, just for a few weeks, he said, just to smooth things out. He tried to make it sound like a favor, like he was offering me a gig, like he was doing me a kindness by bringing me back into the fold. We can probably match your old hourly rate, he said. I almost laughed. I had to cover the phone to stifle it. My old hourly rate. My old rate was for maintenance. My old rate was for the guy who keeps the engine running smooth. My old rate was the peacetime rate. We weren't in peacetime anymore. We were in a war zone, and I was the only bomb disposal expert in the country. He didn't realize that the price of the bolt goes up when the machine is shaking apart. He didn't realize that he wasn't buying my time anymore. He was buying my mercy. I'm pretty busy, I said. I'd have to move some things around. I wasn't busy. I was watching Netflix. But he didn't need to know that. Desperation has a smell. And over the phone line, it smelled like victory. Chapter 13. The power shift they didn't expect. I agreed on my terms. I didn't use their legal team's template. I didn't wait for HR to send me an offer letter. I drafted my own statement of work. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat unemployed for weeks, and I wrote a document that was less of a contract and more of a list of demands. I wrote it with the confidence of a man who knows he is the only water source in a desert. Hourly rate, triple my old salary. Retainer, upfront. Termination clause, none for me, immediate for them. I sent it over. I expected a call from legal. I expected a call from procurement. I expected the usual dance of budget cycles and approvals. But when you are drowning, you don't ask the lifeguard for his certification. You just grab the hand. Hourly, limited scope, no on-call availability. Those were the pillars of my new existence. I defined scope with surgical precision. I would fix the database. I would restart the batch jobs. I would not train the new team. I would not attend strategy alignments. I would not answer emails after 5 p.m. They had paid for my hands, and they had abused them. Now, if they wanted my brain, they had to rent it by the minute. No more quick questions in the hallway. A quick question is a billable event. No more jumping on a call to brainstorm. Brainstorming is a premium service. I stripped away all the emotional labor I used to give for free. The reassuring nods, the late night solidarity, the feeling that we are in this together. We weren't in this together. They were in a hole. I was standing at the top with a rope, and I was charging for the rope by the foot. They accepted immediately. I sent the email at 2:14 p.m. I got the DocuSign notification at 2:26 p.m. 12 minutes. 12 minutes for a corporation to bypass its own bureaucracy. 12 minutes for the CFO to sign off on a rate that was higher than his own. Desperation strips pride clean. It removes the layers of corporate ego. It dissolves the illusion of control. When they saw my terms, they didn't see arrogance. They saw a lifeline. They didn't care about the cost. They only cared about the survival. I looked at the signed contract on my screen. It was the same logo at the top, the same signatures at the bottom, but it wasn't the same company, and I wasn't the same employee. I wasn't a servant anymore. I was a mercenary, and the war was about to begin. Chapter 14. What I saw from the outside. The company hadn't just lost me. It had lost discipline. I walked back into the building on a Monday morning. I didn't have my old badge. I had to go to the front desk and get a visitor sticker. It felt good. It felt temporary. It felt like I was a tourist in a museum of my own history. When I got to the floor, the energy was frantic. It smelled like fear and stale coffee. People were running, literally running, from cubicle to cubicle, from meeting room to meeting room. They were shouting across the open plan office. Did you restart the service? Did you call the vendor? It looked like productivity. It looked like hard work, but it wasn't. It was just motion. Everyone worked harder. No one worked smarter. They were confusing activity with achievement. They were confusing sweat with results. They were running on a treadmill that was unplugged, sweating, panting, and getting nowhere. They had mistaken my calm for ease. In the old days, they would see me sitting at my desk, maybe reading an article, maybe staring out the window. They thought I wasn't working. They thought, he's not busy. We can give him more to do. They didn't realize that my calm was the result of extreme discipline. I wasn't staring out the window because I was bored. I was running a simulation in my head. I wasn't reading an article to kill time. I was researching the patch that would prevent the outage next month. My calm was the sound of a well-oiled machine. Now, the machine was screaming. I saw engineers sleeping under their desks. They wore it like a badge of honor. I haven't been home in 2 days, they bragged. They called it hustle culture. They called it commitment. I called it poor planning. I called it a failure of leadership. If you have to sleep under your desk to keep the lights on, you don't have a job. You have a hostage situation. I sat down at a borrowed desk. The new team leader ran over. He was frantic. His eyes were wide. The database is locked, he screamed. We've been trying to unlock it for 48 hours. We've tried everything. I opened my laptop. I connected to the network. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I poured myself a cup of coffee. I opened a terminal. I typed 3 lines of code. I hit enter. The database unlocked. The red lights on the dashboard turned green. The room went silent. They looked at me like I was a wizard, like I had just cast a spell. How did you do that? The team leader whispered. We tried everything. I took a sip of coffee. You tried everything except checking the transaction log for the orphan process ID, I said. I wasn't a wizard. I was just the guy who wrote the code. I was just the guy who knew that the calm wasn't the absence of work. It was the mastery of it. And in that moment, they realized that for 10 years, they hadn't been paying me to type. They had been paying me to know what to type. Chapter 15. The truth revealed too late. The outsourced system failed audit. It didn't just fail. It failed spectacularly. I spent my first week as a consultant reviewing the code the new team had written. It was spaghetti. It was a mess. They had hard-coded passwords. They had skipped validation checks. They had opened ports that should have been welded shut. It was a security vulnerability wrapped in a feature. I asked them why. Why did you do this? It was faster, they said. We met the deadline. They met the deadline by driving off the cliff. They had optimized for speed, but they had sacrificed integrity. And now, the regulators were back. And they weren't just writing fines. They were writing cease and desist orders. Contracts were terminated, not by us, by our clients. They invoked the material breach clauses. They walked away without paying a penalty. We, on the other hand, paid penalties. Massive penalties. The legal department was no longer reviewing contracts. They were negotiating settlements. Clients exited quietly, then publicly. The first few left with a handshake. The next few left with a lawyer. Then the press got hold of the audit report. Systemic failure, negligence, breach of duty. The words jumped off the page. It wasn't a report. It was an indictment. It indicted the decision to fire the experienced staff. It indicted the decision to outsource to the lowest bidder. It indicted the entire philosophy of efficiency at all costs. The leadership team sat in silence as the general counsel read the highlights. They looked like children who had been caught playing with matches after burning down the garage. They had thought they were building a lean, mean fighting machine. Instead, they had built a glass house in a hailstorm, and the hail was coming down hard. The savings they celebrated were eclipsed by losses. It was simple arithmetic. They saved $150,000 a year on my salary. They saved maybe $500,000 on the rest of the team. Let's call it $1 million. They saved $1 million. The fines from the audit were $5 million. The lost contracts were $10 million. The reputational damage? Priceless. The losses didn't just eclipse the savings. They swallowed them whole. They spent dollars to save pennies. I looked at the CFO. He was staring at a spreadsheet, but I knew he wasn't seeing the numbers. He was seeing his career evaporate. He was realizing that cost-cutting is not a strategy. It's a tactic. And when you use a tactic without a strategy, you lose the war. They had won the battle for the quarterly budget, but they had lost the war for the company's future. Chapter 16. Why I didn't stay. They offered me my old role, but they didn't just offer it. They gilded it. A raise. A massive raise. Double my old salary. A title. Vice President of Engineering. A corner office. The one with the view of the city, not the parking lot. It was everything I had wanted 5 years ago. It was the validation I had craved. It was the apology I had deserved. They put the offer letter on the table. It was heavy. It felt like a brick of gold. We want you to lead the rebuilding, the CEO said. We want you to build it back better. He used the right words. He looked sincere. For a moment, I was tempted. I thought about the mortgage. I thought about the car. I thought about the ego boost of walking back in as the savior. It would have been easy to say yes. It would have been the logical career move. But then I looked at their eyes. They weren't looking at me with respect. They were looking at me with fear. They weren't offering me a job. They were offering me a bribe. I declined. I didn't say no immediately. I told them I needed a few days to think. I spent those days walking the floor. I talked to the engineers. I talked to the support team. I listened to the hum of the machine, and I realized something. The system hadn't changed. The people at the top were the same. The incentives were the same. The culture was the same. They hadn't learned their lesson. They had just learned that pain is expensive. They didn't want to change the way they operated. They just wanted the pain to stop. They wanted me to be the painkiller. They wanted me to come back and hold up the ceiling so they could go back to playing with matches. The rot was still there. It was just painted over with a fresh coat of vice president salary. Only the consequences had arrived. They were experiencing the consequences of their actions, but they hadn't accepted the responsibility for them. And if I stayed, I wouldn't be fixing the system. I would be enabling it. I realized I wasn't their savior. I was their enabler. If I took the job, I would be telling them that it was okay to break things as long as you could pay to fix them. I would be telling them that people are interchangeable as long as you have enough budget. I couldn't do it. I met with the CEO one last time. I slid the offer letter back across the table. It's a generous offer, I said. But I can't accept. Why, he asked. Is it the money? We can do more. It's not the money, I said. Then what is it? It's the architecture, I said. You can't build a skyscraper on a swamp, and you can't build a culture on fear. I stood up. I shook his hand. It was damp. I walked out of the office. I walked past the server room. I walked past my old desk. I walked out the front door and into the sunlight. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a title. I didn't have a steady paycheck. But I had something better. I had clarity, and I had the knowledge that the ceiling was going to fall, and I wouldn't be the one underneath it. Final chapter. How karma works at work. Karma isn't dramatic. It's not a lightning bolt from the sky. It's not a villain twirling a mustache. It's structural. People think karma is magic. It's not. It's cause and effect. It's physics. It's engineering. When you build a house and you use cheap wood and you skip the foundation inspection and the house collapses, that's not bad luck. That's structural karma. When you remove what holds things together to save money, you don't see the damage immediately. That's the trick. That's the trap. You save the money today. The roof stays up today. So you think you got away with it. You think you cheated the system. But you can't cheat gravity. And you can't cheat entropy. You just bought yourself a delay. And delays come with interest. You see it when pressure arrives. The system holds up when things are calm. The system holds up when the sun is shining. But the moment the wind blows, the moment the market turns, the moment a client pushes back, that is when the truth is revealed. They didn't suffer because I left. They wanted to believe that. They wanted to believe I was some vindictive genius who sabotaged them on my way out. It would have been easier for their ego if I was the villain, but I wasn't. I was just the guy who knew where the load-bearing walls were. They suffered because they believed I didn't matter. They suffered because they mistook my salary for a cost instead of an investment. They suffered because they thought they were driving the car when they were really just passengers in a vehicle I was maintaining. And when they fired the mechanic, the car kept rolling until it hit the first turn. I moved on with clarity. I didn't look back with anger. I didn't look back with joy. I looked back with the cold detachment of an auditor. They rebuilt. They had to, but they rebuilt slower. They rebuilt poorer. They rebuilt humbler. They hired 3 people to replace me. They paid them double what they paid me. And it still took them 2 years to get back to where I had them on that Tuesday morning. That isn't revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is messy. This was clean. This was precise. That's arithmetic. The math always wins. You can fudge the numbers in the quarterly report. You can hide the losses in a spreadsheet. But in the end, the equation must balance. Value in equals value out. Respect in equals loyalty out. And if you try to divide by 0, if you try to get something for nothing, the system doesn't just fail. It crashes. And I was already gone. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been the structure that no one noticed, if you have ever been the glue holding a broken system together, let me know. Drop a comment below. Tell me your story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories from the trenches, if you want to hear more about the bodies buried in the corporate graveyard, hit that subscribe button. Like this video. Turn on your post notifications. Because I have a lot more stories to tell. And the next one is even worse. I'll see you in the next chapter.